All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Comprehensive and Informal Study of Critique of Pure Reason. And today we're going over the general problem of pure reason, at least what that is for Kant. I'm here with Patrick today.
Yeah, this one's a doozy for sure.
It is. We're going to get into it.
You definitely there's some books where you can skip the introduction, and obviously we've come across you cannot skip the introduction in the Critique of Pure Reason because the whole problem is now being laid out before us.
Yeah,
Right.
this is a big, general, if you were to take, I mean, there are multiple themes of this book, but if you were to take this statement that you see right here in bold, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? This is for Kant, the general problem of critique of pure reason. Pretty much the main purpose, most would argue, I think, of this book, if not all would argue. Yeah, and it's big. There's a lot of stuff to get through in this section, despite it being only 3 pages. It's a very heavy section, very general, thematic, encompassing, all good adjectives, I think, to use. So hopefully those get you warmed up. And do you have anything else to say before we get into it?
I think we should get into it just because
Yeah,
it's gonna take
gonna
some
be
time.
here for a little while.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump right into it.
So, one has already gained a great deal if one can bring a multitude of investigations under the formula of a single problem. For one thereby not only lightens one's own task by determining it precisely, but also the judgment of anyone who wants to examine whether we have satisfied our plan or not. The real problem of pure reason is now contained in the question: how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Roll credits.
Yeah, this is it.
Title
This is
screen.
it. This is it.
The critique of pure reason.
Yeah. Dun, dun, dun. The end.
Yeah. So before just giving a due introduction to his central question here by saying, "Hey, it's really good if we can summarize this under a simple heading." He summarizes under a simple heading. This is the question: how are synthetic judgments a priori possible?
Which, if you don't know what those are, please go back. This is
Yeah.
essential. This is like if I had to pick one thing that made Kant, it would be this. It would not be like the categorical imperative or anything else. It would be this question, at least theoretically speaking. So this is important. If anything is unclear about this statement to you, please go back or read something else or find some explanation
Talk
to get you
us or
understand.
something.
Yeah, comments.
Because you gotta understand
This is essential.
that sentence as it is written without explanation at this point. So
That being said,
I'll keep going.
yes.
That metaphysics has until now remained in such a vacillating state of uncertainty and contradictions is to be ascribed solely to the cause that no one has previously thought of this problem, and perhaps even of the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. So, this is referencing back to the scandal of philosophy. The question of, hey, how come, unlike mathematics, science, etc., in philosophy, we don't seem to make any progress? We just argue over the same things over and over again. Well, he's saying it's because we haven't formulated this problem before. Well, it seems like we still haven't made progress, and he had formulated it. It's questionable, so it's sort of
but
open.
we'll keep going and
Yes.
let you be your
Yes.
judge of that.
On the solution of this problem, or on a satisfactory proof that the possibility that it demands to have explained does not in fact exist at all, metaphysics now stands or falls. So I'll just go back to make sure that, because I studied there. Okay. Or on a satisfactory proof that the possibility that it demands to have explained does not in fact exist at all, metaphysics now stands or falls. Basically, he's saying there, on either the solution of the problem, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, or on proof that synthetic a priori judgments aren't possible, metaphysics now stands or falls. That's a weird way of phrasing it.
But
that's what
these
he
are
said.
the stakes. He's laying the stakes.
Yes,
The
exactly.
metaphysics is either going to be A-okay or in big trouble.
David Hume, who among all philosophers came closest to this problem, did not conceive of it anywhere near determinately enough and in its universality, but rather stopped with the synthetic proposition of the connection of the effect with its cause, believing himself to have brought out that such an a priori proposition is entirely impossible. And according to his inferences, everything that we call metaphysics would come down to a mere delusion of an alleged insight of reason into that which has in fact merely been borrowed from experience, and from habit has taken on the appearance of necessity. An assertion destructive of all philosophy, on which he never would never have fallen, if he had our problem in its generality before his eyes. Since then he would have comprehended that, according to his argument, there could also be no pure mathematics, since this certainly contains a priori propositions, an assertion from which his sound understanding would surely have protected him. That should not have been one sentence.
No, but this is an English translation of 1700s, late 1700s German academic language. So
Yes,
we get to enjoy that.
but
But he's making quite the claim here. He's saying, if Hume's following his own logic all the way through, then he's going to arrive at the conclusion that there are no pure mathematics, which, I mean, something...
doesn't follow.
No, it doesn't, because
Because-
Hume explains mathematics in his...
So here's
Philosophy.
what Kant is saying and why it doesn't follow. So let's backtrack and talk about David Hume here, because not only was that whole sentence incredible, I mean it was a paragraph of a sentence.
Yeah, I'm trying to find where it started.
It
Up
starts
here,
with
right?
David Hume,
and then ends at the
and then ends at
in
the,
the
end
next
of the paragraph in the next page,
Okay,
and that's a single sentence.
Yeah.
That's not. I don't care if it's German. That's not how you're supposed to write.
there's a semicolon. No, I'm just kidding. This is pretty
The
ridiculous.
comma there doesn't do it, and also stylistically, the semicolon doesn't belong there. Anyway, so let's give context on David Hume again, because I don't think we've gone extensively enough into David Hume to really have context for this.
Yeah. So, David Hume, empiricist philosopher. Do we want to go all the way back to like basic David Hume, like empiricist philosopher?
Yeah, very
yeah,
much.
yeah. So he's an empiricist philosopher who, among other things, I think is most known for his problem of cause and effect, which Kant mentions here, principium causalitatis, Latin or something, seems like. And what essentially this is, Hume says that we can't know cause and effect and such. Trying to think of a good way to phrase it. We can't really objectively know that cause and effect is like real, so to speak. For example, there are causes, there are just things that happen, right, in the world, and what makes certain things related to each other doesn't seem to have any like systematic or scientific way of deducing that or objectively sound. It's sort of just like we take things and in our heads we're like, okay, yeah, so this is a cause and this is an effect, right? It's like if I like kick the wall or something and then the sound is produced, we'll say, oh, well, that happened because you kicked the wall. It's like, well, where do we get that? Where does that like judgment, Kant would call it, how does that happen in our heads, and more importantly, how do we know that that's true? How do we know that there isn't some like, going back to like Descartes or something, right? Some like just demon like fucking with us, making a sound every time someone kicks a wall. It's like we're not really gonna be able to know what's objectively out there as a cause and effect, if such a thing is objectively true at all. It's sort of just something that we come up with in our heads and to make sense of the world and cope with reality and deal with these like bundle of impressions, to use more Humean language. So that's generally the problem, but at least as it relates to cause and effect.
Yes.
Hume.
So dealing with cause and effect, there's really kind of two problems,
Yes.
which you might call the problem of induction and the problem of causation. So the problem of causation, right, is this fact that, okay, we have ideas of cause and effect, but where do they come from? There appears to be no impression, meaning nothing we could imagine or see or sense or remember or anything like that correlates to cause and effect. Rather, we, see one thing happen and then we see another thing happen. But where's the connection between the two of them? Right.
And for Hume, just in your head isn't good enough because he's an empiricist. He thinks, knowledge needs to be derived from some, to use his language, impression. That's sort of where we get knowledge in Hume's philosophy, roughly speaking. Mathematics is a little stranger with that, but generally speaking, at least for something like cause and effect for Hume, it would need to come from the senses. And Hume says we can't find the cause of cause and effect in our senses. So this is weird, guys. This isn't really something we can know for Hume.
Well, there's sort of an Occam's razor to it, right? If I have an impression of burning after impression of fire, like the burning sensation associated with fire, I might think that the fire causes the burning, but all that's really there, actually, literally, is fire and then burning, right? Mm-hmm. There's succession, to be sure, but the causation doesn't actually seem to add anything at all. So that's the problem of, that's what I'm going to call the problem of causation, distinct from the problem of induction, which is that how do we know that the burning is going to follow after the fire? Well, we only believe it has because it has in the past. But how do we know that the future will be like the past? Only because of the past. So it's cyclical logic. So two different problems there. One, how do we get the idea of causation? And two, how could we establish causation? Right? Mm-hmm. So this is basically what our spat was about in the past, right?
It was, and I think you'll be pleased to inform that I thought about it a lot more, read some things, and I'm a lot more sympathetic to your I still don't know if it's as clear cut as Kant doesn't defend it at all, but I do agree that it's a lot more of an open thing that he doesn't extensively cover, and it's mainly focusing on that
the
first
problem of causation,
right? Yes,
what I'll call the problem of causation.
Yes.
But anyway, to move forward with this paragraph of a sentence.
Yes.
He says basically that, all right, Hume says we don't see any kind of connection of cause and effect. We don't have any reason to assert a connection of cause and effect. And there seems to be no reason where we could get the universality of cause and effect from experience or from necessary relations of ideas, right? And
that's where Kant would say he's wrong.
Yes, but Kant would say also that this somehow invalidates mathematics. And what I think he's doing is...
No, I don't think it's that direct. I think he's making a jump saying...
Well, if there are no synthetic a priori... Yes, exactly. But that doesn't follow.
But he's not saying there's no...
But that doesn't follow from what Hume says. Hume does not say that there are no synthetic a priori judgments. He says that cause and effect don't add anything to our experience, and they're not necessary for our relations of ideas. They don't add anything to the matters of fact,
right.
So what do? Hume basically has a fork where everything is either a relation of ideas or a matter of fact.
Yes.
Right? So a matter of fact can be shown through experience, right? And a relation of idea, we don't need to appeal to experience because it's just necessarily contained within the ideas.
Yes.
Now,
his analytic, to use Kantian language, he has analytic judgments and...
Well, no, he has empirical judgments and he has...
a priori analytical judgments.
That's questionable. He doesn't say that they're analytical judgments because he doesn't make the same distinction with the same language that Kant does.
Right, I know, but that's what Kant's saying, though, is that if we frame,
Kant saying Hume explicitly says...
Kant's saying he's missing a thing of the fork.
Yes, right. Kant is saying that this relations of ideas should be split up into analytic and synthetic a priori judgments.
Hume mistakenly bundled into one big thing and assumed that was it.
Yes. But he's saying that somehow the fact that he's invalidating causation as belonging appropriately to neither of these sections of the fork, right? Causation to Hume doesn't belong on the fork. and therefore it doesn't mean anything.
Right, because he only has two prongs.
Right, and it's not a relation of it is a relation of ideas, but it's not a relation of
in
ideas
the Humean
that's
sense. Yeah.
It's not a relation of ideas that's necessary immediately from what it is.
Yes.
Which is probably to say that it isn't analytic, right?
Yes. No, and Kant would agree.
I think Hume, if he were to be introduced to this and really understand this, would probably have to make the case that mathematics is analytic.
Yeah. I think he would try to do that. Based on how we talked about it.
Because he sorts the analytic together with mathematical propositions.
Yes.
But
Rip
Kant,
Hume, you would have loved Critique of Pure Reason.
Yeah, well, maybe. It's interesting because Hume is actually pretty critical of his own academic philosophy. He says that, like, no one cares about all this technical crap. Basically, people only want, like, Marcus Aurelius, and they want, like, self-help.
Yeah.
No one will remember John Locke hundreds of years from now. He says that.
Becomes a historian.
He says no one will remember John Locke. They'll all remember this other guy, and I couldn't even remember his name, but he just gave, like, self-help in the 1700s or something like that.
Jordan Peterson.
So he was wrong.
Great-grandfather.
He was wrong about how useful his work was. It was more useful than he thought.
Yes, which props to him, man. Yeah.
But anyway,
here we are dealing with it now.
To return to this, I think Kant rather unfairly says that Hume is necessarily invalidating all synthetic a priori judgments because he's saying that causation doesn't add up. Because he's saying that causation doesn't add on to the force.
Is that what Kant's saying, though, or is Kant just saying that Hume's missing synthetic a priori? And because Kant argues that it's synthetic a priori, Kant thinks.
Well, he doesn't make. He
Okay.
doesn't. I don't
So
think
he's unfairly. Okay, I think I see what's happening here. Kant is basically unfairly shoving his definition of mathematics in Hume's philosophy and being like, haha.
Well, it's more than that because even if Hume were to admit that there's now a distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, it doesn't follow that we need causation as a synthetic judgment. Like,
no,
it doesn't follow
I think those are two separate arguments. I don't think they're...
Right, but I'm saying it doesn't follow. Suppose Hume says, okay, relations of ideas should be split further up into analytic and synthetic relations of ideas.
Okay.
It doesn't follow from that causation now, like, he now has to accept causation as a valid inference.
No, but that's what... Well, Kant's
causation
argue.
is in the class of synthetic a priori judgments, but what if he accepts cause and effect, but not the what if Hume doesn't accept cause and effect, but accepts the other synthetic a priori judgments that are necessary for mathematics? Because cause and effect isn't actually necessary for mathematics. Yeah, no, exactly. He could do that.
He could do that.
So
is Kant saying he can't do that?
Yes.
Where? I think I'm
because he's saying
missing something.
An assertion destructive of all philosophy, on which he never would have fallen if he had a problem in its generality before his eyes, since he then would have comprehended that, according to his argument, there could also be no pure mathematics.
Okay.
So he seems to be saying here that Hume is saying synthetic a priori judgments are not possible.
Right, destructive
and
of all
that's
pure philosophy.
Not what Hume's saying.
Okay.
That just isn't what Hume's saying.
Okay, all right. That's fair. I get that interpretation now. All right.
So...
Yeah, Kant's being a little too over-encompassing.
I think he's skipping a few steps. I think he actually could make this argument, but doing so would take a while.
Yeah, and honestly, you can see him construct an argument which you yourself, without the help of Kant here, can compare that to Hume yourself and then see how it stands up.
All right,
so,
that's enough critiquing the critique for right now.
Yes,
let's move forward.
Move on. Okay. In the solution of the above problem, there is at the same time contained the possibility of the pure use of reason in the grounding and execution of all sciences that contain theoretical a priori cognition of objects, i.e. the answer to the questions, how is pure mathematics possible, and how is pure natural science possible? So Kant's basically saying here that to answer these questions, you need theoretical a priori cognition because that's what kind of makes up these things.
Synthetic
for Kant.
Specifically, you need synthetic judgments a priori.
I was thinking about saying that, but it's just in the specific. I don't think he said synthetic in this specific paragraph.
He says the solution here of the above problem.
Right, and that's synthetic. Okay, yeah,
contains the possibility of using it for these.
Okay,
things.
yes, all right, so
Yeah.
you're right. So yes, he's talking about synthetic then. Okay, yes, so yes, for Kant you need synthetic a priori judgments, and if you want like examples of what Kant would consider synthetic a priori judgments, you can go back to the previous section where he has like sections with numbered like 1 and 2 or 2 and 3 or something like that with these headings. So go
right.
see that if that's confusing at all. But
I want to continue. You should
Yes.
read the asterisk. It's important here.
does that apply?
It's not. It's in the next paragraph.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say okay. Okay, so I'll read the next paragraph and do the asterisk. Okay. About these sciences, since they are actually given, it can appropriately be asked how they are possible. For that they must be possible is proved through their actuality. Okay, so this is a claim which has a asterisk. So it says some may still doubt this last point in the case of natural science. Yet one need merely consider the various propositions that come
Pure
forward.
natural science, mind you.
Yes,
It's
sorry.
important here. He's not doubting that
Yes,
natural. He's not saying that someone could doubt empirical natural science.
Yes, pure natural science. Okay. Yet one need merely consider the various propositions that come forth at the outset of proper empirical physics, such as those of the persistence of the same quantity of matter, of inertia, of the equality of effect and counter effect, etc. And one will quickly be convinced that they constitute a physicia pura or rationalis, rationalis, which well deserves to be separately established as a science of its own in its whole domain, whether narrow or wide. Okay.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
man?
this is.
He just goes. Some people may doubt that we can do science in our heads without doing any experiments, but think about it and you'll be convinced. I've thought about it. I'm not convinced.
Which not only does he say that, but this should be separated from like the rest of natural science as its
there's
own
pure
domain.
physics that you can do in your head, and through it you can learn that the same quantity of matter has to stay the same, which is totally true and has not at all been disproven by relativity.
Even without going into relativity, it's like, is that even like? How would you get matter without
empirical? I don't know. I
guess you just look at matter and think about what it is and be like,
No, you don't look at matter. You just have to. I guess you have a pure intuition of matter. I don't know. I don't get it.
No, well, he says empirical physics. So such as okay, so it's empirical. So that part is a posteriori. But then I guess he's saying you can make.
But he said previously that the persistence of the same quantity of matter is a priori pure physics.
And he's saying that here too. Persistence of the same quantity of matter.
Yes, I know. That's what I'm saying. So he's saying that the things that we have at the outset of empirical physics, right, are propositions which had to have been proved by pure physics. That's what he's claiming, right? We had to already have the idea of conservation of matter, inertia, and, for every reaction, they had an equal and opposite reaction. All those Newtonian principles that he established through experiments. Yeah, it turns out the whole time everyone could have known it just by thinking.
Yeah, I mean, if that is what he's saying, that is wrong. I want to make sure
that is, dude, think about
it. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that's really shaky. I'm not 100, like, I get what you're saying, and I agree if that's the case. It's just I'm wondering if there's like some alternative like angle he was viewing this from, where it's like, okay, we're given a posteriori, right, like empirical like physics, and then from these entities we can, through like cause and effect or something, or some other a priori process, learn these principles.
So really the whole thing here is shaky at the outset, though, because you have, how is pure natural science possible, and we already doubt if that's true, and how is pure mathematics possible, and we've already doubted previously in previous sections that mathematics isn't analytic, right?
There isn't synthetic here.
We've doubted that it isn't analytic, which means
doubted that it isn't. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
we think that it's possible. It's an open question whether it's analytic or synthetic.
Yeah.
Right. And so if that's true, then Hume's fork maybe holds, and we could say that those relations of ideas are analytic. And if that's the case, we do have synthetic a posteriori judgments and analytic a priori judgments, and there is no synthetic a priori, and the whole thing falls down. So I think he really should put more into defending these claims. I think he just takes them for granted very easily.
This is not. I mean, regardless of the accuracy, the argument in itself is not like strong at all. He's literally just saying, think about it. And then he goes as far as to say that we should have our own science of the, like that's what I mean. I feel like Kant wouldn't just I don't know. I feel like something's missing. Kant doesn't seem like the kind of dude that would just make this huge claim. We need a whole separate science, guys, for this great thing that I'm telling you about, and then just be like, nah.
Kant is much more of an explainer than an arguer, and he typically appeals to intuition rather than knockdown proofs. He doesn't try to reduce his opponents to absurdity. He rather says, hey, look at this, and you will observe that this is the way things are.
Yeah.
That's the way he tends to operate.
But this is way too, this argument is just shit.
Yeah, it is.
So,
it's weak. There may be further things that are stronger.
I was going to say,
let's later, but I don't recall being convinced.
All right, so let's continue. Noted, this argument is dog shit. Good pointing out that this, if Kant has a defendable thing here, you need to explain it better, is the point. And if he doesn't, then this is just a problem.
Yes.
So these are the two possibilities.
Wrap up this paragraph.
Okay, wrap up this asterisk.
Yes.
Okay, so
the
continuing.
asterisk is done.
Yes, so now, as far as metaphysics is concerned, however, it's poor progress up to now, and the fact that of no metaphysics thus far expounded can it even be said that, as far as its essential end is concerned, it even really exists, leaves everyone with ground to doubt its possibility. So this is kind of like going back to what Descartes was saying with his meditations, and it's kind of what kicked off modern philosophy, is that, okay, guys, metaphysics, we can doubt all this shit, right? All this like all this God stuff, all this soul stuff, all this like true reality stuff, it can all be doubted, is essentially the problem. And we haven't found, like as Kant says, we've done poor jobs. Poor progress has been made towards solidifying what metaphysics is and what we can get from it. We're kind of just like putting propositions out there, and okay, yeah, assuming like God is this thing, then we can, I guess, draw these inferences. But like the general arguments for these core metaphysical entities have been, in Kant's view, quite poor up to this point. And like I said, that them being so poor is what kind of, I think anyway, kicked off like this whole project of modern philosophy. Do you have anything to?
Yeah, I do have something to add. I'm going to steelman Kant a little bit here.
Okay.
As far as metaphysics, Kant argues that metaphysics requires synthetic judgments a priori in order to assert the actual existence of anything, right? Because it doesn't seem like by making an analytic judgment, I'm asserting that anything actually exists. For instance, I might try to get around this by saying, okay, a unicorn is a unicorn, right? Mm-hmm. The definition of a unicorn is a horse with one horn, let's say. Let's suppose. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, horns exist, right? Horses exist. I couldn't say something is truly a horse if it doesn't exist, or that it has a horn if it doesn't exist. So it must follow that something is not truly a unicorn unless it exists. Right? That seems to follow. Well, then it would seem to follow that because a unicorn is a unicorn, and it's not truly a unicorn if it doesn't exist, a unicorn exists.
Yeah, no, I was going to say you have a lot of assumptions there.
Yeah, so it seems right, but it seems to be this is the way how we would the only way how we could analytically argue for the actual existence of anything, right? And in metaphysics, according to Kant, we are arguing that certain things actually exist in the real world. They aren't just things that we talk about.
Yeah, we don't just assume their existence for the sake of equating it to itself or some other analytic process.
Yes. In contrast, if I were to say analytically, this is an uncontroversial thing. A unicorn is not a abstract two-dimensional shape, right? A unicorn is not an abstract two-dimensional shape. I am not asserting the actual existence of unicorns or abstract two-dimensional shapes. Mm-hmm. My judgment is merely an analytical one. Mm-hmm. Right? So it seems like the only way I can assert something is actually real, right? And metaphysics is about reality, is through a synthetic judgment.
Yeah.
So that's his statement. And for those of you who have followed the ontological argument at all, basically this is his argument against the ontological argument.
Yeah.
Right?
Because that's analytic, yeah.
Yes, exactly. People say, oh, the essence of God entails God's existence. Basically, that because God is the most perfect being, it would be more perfect if God existed, therefore God exists. And so it's an attempt to analyze God into existence.
Descartes.
Yeah. So it's an attempt to analyze God into existence, and Kant is saying, well, no,
Can't do that. Yeah.
Existence isn't a proposition. In order to actually say that something exists, you have to synthesize that thing with basically reality. Mm-hmm. Right.
Which he's going to go into, which you said we're pretty close, right, to the end of the introduction into the...
Yeah.
So what reality is for Kant, we're going to get into shortly after a few more sections.
In summary, if we want to actually assert anything is real with our metaphysics that we didn't already know, right, then it would be the case that we need to have synthetic judgments a priori, it would seem. So... that's why Kant is saying metaphysics has made such poor progress, because it doesn't even get into how synthetic a priori judgments are possible.
Exactly. We're just kind of throwing, that's what I was saying before, but just like throwing propositions about like God and other things and be like, okay, yeah, well, if we assume God is like this, then yeah, we can draw all these inferences. But the problem is, like Patrick was saying, we're not synthesizing God with reality. We're just throwing a proposition out there and then deducing it, hoping we can find some like, grasp at metaphysical straws and get something, quote unquote real. And Kant says that's not the way to go about it. We need to establish the synthetic a priori by just nature of how it works and by nature of not being able to do so analytically, like Patrick just talked about. So that's his claim, and that's roughly his reasoning. And
the spoiler is that in showing how synthetic a priori judgments are possible, Kant also limits them to a certain scope.
Yes, he does limit them actually quite a lot, which is a lot of motivation for post-Kantians to unlimit reason and expand metaphysics. Hegel. Anyway, that's all
right.
later on.
Yes.
So we can continue with this.
Continue now.
Yes.
So, but given this kind of cognition is, in a certain sense, also to be regarded as given, and metaphysics is actual, if not as a science, yet as a natural predisposition. I think there was an if. I thought there was an if there. That was a complete sentence. Okay. For human reason, without being moved by the mere vanity of knowing it all, inexorably pushes on, driven by its own need to such questions that cannot be answered by any experiential use of reason, and of principles borrowed from such use. And thus a certain sort of metaphysics has actually been present in all human beings as soon as reason has extended itself to speculation in them. And it will always remain there. And now, about this too, the question is, how is metaphysics, as a natural predisposition, possible? I.e., how do the questions that pure reason raises, and which it is driven by its own need to answer as well as it can, arise from the nature of universal human reason? This is an underrated argument.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, then this is like the essence, for at least the ending here, is like the essence of modern philosophy, right? It's like, how is metaphysics, like, how does it arise out of human reason, right? Because that's not something,
right.
That's not something we've really seen up until, at least at this point in the history of Western philosophy. It's not really something we've seen, even, from the time of the ancients. It's always like the subject trying to meet some like objective standard, right? Right. Even Hume, right? That's what he was doing with cause and effect. He was trying to get cause and effect to meet this objective, real standard. And Kant's kind of flipping it. He's saying, no, how does it? Well, maybe not how does it meet us, but how do basically it's a whole new question. Like
What is it
how do we
about our
construct
nature
it?
that causes
Yes.
metaphysics to arise?
Yes.
Right. So if we were to listen to logical positives in the 20th century, they're out of fashion anyway. No one likes them anymore. Right. Metaphysical propositions are meaningless. Well, that does a very poor job of explaining how, as a species, we're always driven to consider them necessarily. Now, a lot of people think metaphysics is dry, very specific, hyper-specific stuff. But what human being hasn't seriously considered, hey, do I have something above the physical that persists, or do I not? Does the universe have a beginning, or does it not? Right? Is there some kind of supreme being? Is there not? These basic metaphysical questions, pretty much everyone is driven to consider them at some point or another. It's innate in human reason. And if metaphysics is not possible, right, achievable, whatever, we have to explain why the predisposition is possible. Why are we even thinking about it? How does it even come into our heads if it's meaningless, like some people are trying to assert? It doesn't make sense that human reason would naturally give rise to a bunch of meaningless jumbles of things that don't mean anything to the humans coming up with it.
Yeah. So that's an argument. And like I said, it's sort of... what's fascinating for me about that too is sort of what I was saying before, the fact that it arises out of universal human reason. This for me, like when I was first getting into Kant, like it changed the game. It's not, again, it's because the assumption, right? Even in some like other philosophies, it's like it's the subject, us trying to meet an objective reality, and now it's like we're kind of integrated and almost sort of the creator in a way of this. And that doesn't mean, Kant does specify it's a universal human reason, right?
Well,
and if in our reading of Kant, we can see that this isn't just like metaphysical anarchy. There are lots of rules and objectivity that goes into this, universality that goes into this, but still fundamentally we're changing the nature of a metaphysics. We're integrating it almost with like epistemology here. It's quite the move, quite the revolutionary move.
It's like for years and years and years, people go on asking, what is life? What is the universe? What is all this stuff? Blah, 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 blah. And Kant just goes along and says, who's asking?
Yeah. It's wild, man. It takes us beyond. I mean, not that other philosophy is just like stoner philosophy, but like I feel like this is, for me, this is like a real step up, and
like,
it's
who are you that you are capable of questioning?
Yeah, what are the conditions that you need to even like be able to formulate that question? So this is just a whole when this clicked in my head, this was huge. So I hope for anyone listening, it's also you realize the gravity of this in the history of philosophy and metaphysics and epistemology. Really, it's huge. But yeah. Right. So with that,
I'll pick it up.
Kant praise out of the way. Yes, please do.
But since unavoidable contradictions have always been found in all previous attempts to answer these natural questions, e.g., whether the world has a beginning or exists from eternity, etc., one cannot leave it up to the mere natural predisposition to metaphysics, i.e., to the pure faculty of reason itself, from which, to be sure, some sort of metaphysics, whatever it might be, always grows, but it must be possible to bring it to certainty regarding either the knowledge or ignorance of objects, i.e., to come to a decision either about the objects of its questions or about the capacity and incapacity of reason for judging something about them. Thus, either to reliably extend our pure reason or else to set determinate and secure limits to it. This last question, which flows from the general problem above, would rightly be this: how is metaphysics possible as a science? So, let's break this down because there's a number of interesting things here.
Yes.
Right, which, again, should just be broken up into different sentences.
Nope, not for Kant.
but
got to do it yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So, first of all, the first thing I found particularly interesting is some sort of metaphysics, whatever it might be, always grows. Basically, the assertion that we cannot avoid the questions. in some form or another. If I skeptically answer the questions and say no one can know, that itself is a metaphysical question. If I say things are just exactly how they appear to me, whatever, that's a metaphysical answer too. It doesn't matter what you give, it's a metaphysical answer according to Kant. And the other part that Kant says generally here is, if we have this natural predisposition, it seems to follow that we should also, it must be possible, he says, and I think that's true, but he doesn't argue it. It must be possible either to come to a decision about whether we are capable of knowing the stuff, or to just figure it out, right? So if the question I formulated is, does the world have a beginning or exist from eternity, right? His example. By virtue of the fact that I've formulated it, I should either be able to answer the question or figure out for myself, tell you, whether I can answer the question or not.
Answer or limit, basically.
Yeah, it seems logical to say that. But at the same time,
There's some
Kant
nuance
hasn't...
there.
Well, it seems logical to say that, but at the same time, it's not a knockdown deductive argument, and it also seems like that hasn't actually happened. Since Kant said this, it's not as if people stopped doing metaphysics.
Yeah. And that goes back to like before, like what we were referencing about like really messing with the scale of like the limit of reason. It's like, how really limited is it? What can we know? This is it's a hot topic, really. But I mean, the general like conception, I don't think is too controversial. Like, I mean, because no, right?
Have to be able to figure out whether we can know or not.
Yeah, because it's like you're not just gonna.
It seems, in theory, to be true.
Yeah, like I can't really
But
come
it
up with a
doesn't.
counter
In
example.
practice, right? We haven't agreed on it, and it only seems in theory to be true intuitively. I don't see a logical argument for that.
Yeah, the best I can right off the top of my head right now is that I just can't come up with a counter example. But I mean, doesn't mean it's not out there.
All right. I'm going to do this next short sentence.
Yeah.
And then how about you do the last two then?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, so the critique of reason thus finally leads necessarily to science. Mind you, this is not natural science.
Yeah, science
This
as a whole,
means-
including philosophy.
Yes, science meaning knowledge, actually.
Yeah, a
Which
systematic
is a
way of
highly
knowing.
ironic semantic title in retrospect. But you're going to find this if you read Kant and if you read Hegel, especially, etc., etc. Science means something different. Science means stuff that you can actually know.
Yeah.
But that's because it actually is derived from the word. Scientia is skio is to know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I always interpreted science generally as like the system by which you know things.
yeah.
Systematic way to obtain knowledge. Something like that.
But the irony here is that anything that we would call science today is not science, according to this definition.
Yeah, I mean, what is science today is just a hot topic in general that I feel like would...
Well, science is always open to doubt.
Oh, yes.
By its very
Oh, yes, like scientific method. Like, oh,
Yes.
yes, doubt this,
Scientific-
hypothesize, come up with a new... Yeah, okay.
Yes.
It's much more dialectical in nature, I
Right,
suppose.
exactly.
Okay.
To scientific.
Yeah, okay, yes.
Yes.
Okay,
So it's
all right.
ironic in that sense.
Yes, all right.
The dogmatic use of it without critique, on the contrary, leads to groundless assertions, to which one can oppose equally plausible ones, thus to skepticism. This is that dogmatism versus skepticism dichotomy he
Distinction,
sets up, which he wants to answer with a new criticality, basically.
Yeah.
Dogmatism is, for him, the process of asserting without questioning the means by which you are enabled to assert.
Yes, which he was just speaking, like, he was just accusing metaphysics of up to how people have been practicing metaphysics is essentially he's saying was dogmatic.
And
up to this
skepticism,
point.
of course, is the response. He's saying when you have opposed dogmatisms, you say, well, I can't decide. No one can decide. It's unknowable. So skepticism. He wants to move past dogmatism and skepticism with what he calls criticality.
Yep. So, with that said, further, this science cannot be terribly extensive, for it does not deal with objects of reason, whose multiplicity is infinite, but merely with itself, with problems that spring entirely from its own womb, and that are not set before it by the nature of things that are distinct from it, but through its own nature, so that once it has become completely familiar with its own capacity in regard to the objects that may come before it in experience, then it must be easy to determine, completely and securely, the domain and the bounds of its attempted use beyond all bounds of experience. I'm going to read that again in my head real quick.
Okay.
Because that was a lot. I don't know if you have anything off the bat to say about it.
Yeah, so essentially all he's saying here is that there are not going to be an infinite number of problems and propositions that the science of pure reason
Oh, right. Okay.
is going to come up with.
Yeah.
Because it's just examining itself.
Yeah. And then once you have your limits, you have your set of objects in which you can make judgments.
Right. In other words, the limits themselves are, because they are limits and because they are the limits of the mind as such and come from pure reason as such, they're limited in scope. There's only so much to talk about. And Kant says he's going to talk about all of them.
Yeah, which, there really must not be, that many then if he can get it all in one.
It's a big book.
It's a big book, but a lot of it is spent talking about the same stuff as us who have looked ahead. And
well, yeah, that's what he's saying, that there are not that many.
Yes. Okay. Cool. Then he says, thus, one can and must regard as undone all attempts made until now to bring about a metaphysics dogmatically. For what is analytic in one or the other of them, namely the mere analysis of the concepts that inhabit our reason a priori, is not the end at all, but only a preparation for metaphysics proper, namely extending its a priori cognition synthetically. And it is useless for this end, because it merely shows what is contained in these concepts, but not how we attain such concepts a priori, in order thereafter to be able to determine their valid use in regard to the objects of all cognition in general. It also requires only a little self-denial in order to give up all these claims, since the contradictions of reason, which cannot be denied and which are so unavoidable in dogmatic procedure, have long since destroyed the authority of every previous metaphysics. More resolution will be necessary in order not to be deterred by an internal difficulty and external resistance from using another approach, entirely opposed to the previous one, in order to promote the productive and fruitful growth of a science that is indispensable for human reason, and from which one can chop down every stem that is shot up without ever being able to eradicate its root. So that is the end of the section, and basically he is shitting on dogmatic metaphysics. You just can't get anywhere, like he says, you can't grow fruitfully just being dogmatic, right? It's going to produce contradictions, and which, as he explained earlier, leads to skepticism.
Yes.
And they're unavoidable when you do it dogmatic. That's the big thing. They're unavoidable when you do it as it's been done, right? It's dogmatically. You're just going to assert things and assert the negation of things, right? And you're just going to be talking about it all day. For Kant, not making any progress to me like that. We need to take a step back here, stop doing it dogmatically, and show really for Kant, these are the synthetic a priori cognitions. And then once we analyze them as such, we can start making progress, that he says it's going to be productive and fruitful, rather than just talking about the same thing all the time. We have to eradicate its root.
Yeah, and the basic problem here with dogmatic metaphysics and why it winds up going into contradictions is because it merely analyzes its concepts rather than showing how they synthesize with reality, which is to say they are possible. Mm-hmm. Right. So what I talked about previously, the unicorn, which exists because it exists, God, which exists because the nature of God entails its existence, etc., right? You do this process and you wind up in contradictions, basically. So The reason it winds up at all those contradictions is because it is not even making the distinction between synthesis and analysis. So it conflates synthetic arguments with analytic arguments, right? And mixes them together haphazardly. And the analytic arguments don't actually add anything, but they are sometimes supposed to, right?
Yeah, so they're taken as if they are supposed to. This is like,
Right.
he's really, I mean, at least for me, what comes to mind off the bat is like all the theistic arguments, right? And they're made by the metaphysicians of medieval times.
Right.
They talk about God as if it's this like just understood, you know, for Kant, synthetic a priori, or at least synthetic thing, but then they're just really analytically, they're putting forward the propositions of God, right? Like, you know, what are the things like omnipotent, omnipresent, etc. And they're just kind of deducing things about God, and it's like, well, how do you synthesize that with reality is the question, and to which they have no answer in the Kantian view, because
Right.
we're analytically we're putting forward these propositions, not investigating where they're coming from, then just making analytic judgments about them to sum it up.
So, and he gets into that later in the critique. He actually will examine specifically the main contradictions, the principal contradictory propositions in the
Transcendental dialectic.
The transcendental dialectic, exactly.
Yep.
Where he puts forward these, he says, fallacious arguments about the eternity of the world, the immortality of the soul, the unity of the mind, etc.,
Existence of
and the
God,
existence
yeah.
of God. And that's very famously, he deals with the three, Kant says really the three main like theistic arguments, period, that have come forward through the use of speculative reason. The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the physio-theological argument, right? And he says, well, all of the other ones rely on the ontological argument. And the ontological argument conflates thinks that you can analyze things into existence, which according to Kant, you can't.
Right,
You
we
need to
talked about
perform
that
some kind of
earlier,
synthetic judgment to say that something actually exists.
Yep.
So, yeah.
That's the section.
The section. And up next, we have the last section of the introduction.
Oh, and then it gets real beefy after
Yeah.
that. What is the
last section, the idea and division of a special science under the name of a critique of pure reason.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's an annoying section in which he goes into how he's going to divide up
the book, basically. So it's that one's not nearly as exciting as this one. That'll be a quick one to get through.
Well, it's longer is the problem. It's long and it's difficult to understand, and it's ultimately just to justify the way he uses words, because Kant definitely does not have the sense that words are arbitrary. He is a strong linguistic prescriptivist.
Yes.
Like he thinks that words just have meaning and they're sitting out there. And I don't think he actually thinks this necessarily. I don't think you could question him on that. But like the way he acts, he's like, for instance, he's the kind of guy who goes, I don't know, can you use the bathroom? You, right? Yeah. No, it's this way. It's this way. This is the improper use of the word. This is the correct use of the word. Source, everyone knows it.
Source, investigate your own intuition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just observe your own intuition. Well, and so he basically just argues about fallacious ways that people use words, and then tells you, this is why I divided it this way.
Yeah, well, that's coming up next time. So if you're into like
organons and propaideutics,
if you're into autistic-esque analysis of just words, which I mean, to be fair, this is very helpful for the reading, but just because of the way he writes. So if you're into that thing, that's coming up next. Hope you're excited for that.
Very exciting.
This is for me, I think, my favorite section of the introduction. This is great. this is what the book is thematically, and all those adjectives I threw out in the beginning. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be there next time for the last section of the introduction, and then we get to go transcendental aesthetic, and then it gets real, real, and real annoying to read. But that's all coming up. So thank you.
Yeah, you thought it was bad so far.
Yeah, no, it gets worse reading wise, but we'll be here to break it down. Hopefully,
if we can figure it out.
Yeah. So, thank you, and any closing thoughts, Patrick, that you haven't espoused already?
Synthetic a priori judgments, are they possible at all? I don't know. Does our knowledge depend on them? I don't know. I don't think he really cleared that up.
Well, hopefully he will. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks.